How's it going, people? Welcome to United View and welcome to the Tactical View. And at this point, it is unfortunately Tactical View heritage. Another defeat for Manchester United against Brighton. For those of you that have been around long enough and you've watched the very first Tactical View, you may recall that was after a 4-0 drubbing from Brighton. And once again, we find ourselves in a pretty similar position where we've been destroyed tactically by a team that looked much better coached, much better profiled, and a squad that actually looks well built. A squad that cost, I think the starting 11 cost about £16 million, which is probably about half of Jadon Sancho's wage for the season. So I'll just let that a bit of perspective sit there. But before we get into that and depress ourselves, there are some good moments to talk about. Not many, but we'll start with the good bits in terms of how United set up, why we did it, and actually for 20 minutes it worked quite well. So as pretty much everyone not in the stadium would have noticed on TV, because it's pretty easy to see on TV, a little bit harder perhaps to work out in the stadium. But United set up with a diamond. So we had the back four as usual: Dalot, Lindelof, Martinez and Reguilon. Maybe Reguilon's not as usual, but there's no one else fit at this point, so it had to be him. Rashford in the team as usual. Højlund made his first start for United, and we had the midfield diamond of Casemiro at the base, Eriksen and Scott McTominay in the wide positions, and Bruno Fernandes as the number 10. Now, the idea with the diamond, I think the reason Ten Hag's using it is because he wants to get more out of Marcus Rashford and Rasmus Højlund. And the idea here is that both of them are pretty quick, pretty physical, and you can use them as the outlets either side. And in terms of tactical dynamics, the main thing that United were trying to do is exploit the fact that a lot of teams now are defending with a man-to-man press. So that means that if you're going man-for-man defensively, you're less worried about space and you're more worried about controlling players. And the way an attacking team can manipulate that is if you bring your players into a congested area, that then frees up space on the other side of the pitch, which, because the defending team are controlling players, not space, they're not too worried about. And obviously, if there's a lot of space and you get someone like Marcus Rashford or Rasmus Højlund in that space, that's where you can create an advantage. So whereas in previous years you might have seen teams defending zonally, where each player's got a particular zone to cover in their 4-4-2, for example, and the way to attack that is create numerical advantages. If teams are defending man-to-man, the way to sort of counteract that and beat that is to suck their players in one area of the pitch, manipulate them in the space, and use the spatial advantage rather than the numerical advantage. And that was the aim of what United did at the start of this game. Now, in terms of how well it worked, we've got a sequence here to show really the ideas from United and how Brighton actually pressed to start with. So this is the only bit of the show where we'll be talking about United with the ball and Brighton without it, because let's be honest, it didn't really happen after the first 20 minutes. So we'll enjoy it while it lasts anyway. So you've got this picture here. Andre Onana's on the ball over there. And what I want to sort of draw out here is the shape that Brighton have got. So you can see what I mean here in terms of their man-to-man press. So Lallana, obviously this ball's come from Lindelof to Onana, and Lallana here has started by pressing Lindelof, and once Lindelof's given the pass back, he's gone to press Onana, making sure that he's between Lindelof and Onana as well, so he can't pass that back. So Lallana basically was pressing Lindelof to start with, curved his run round to try and force United up to that side, where Brighton have got man-for-man. In every area of the pitch, they can try and press it and create a transition. Now, if you look at Brighton's setup over the rest of the pitch, you've got Dalot there, marked by Mitoma. You've got Dahoud there, pressing up on Casemiro. You've got Welbeck there on Lisandro Martinez, I forgot who that was for a second, and Reguilon there with Adingra opposite him, ready to jump as soon as that pass goes out there. They're sort of leaving Reguilon free as a trigger to go and press. So you can see how Brighton is set up. Now, obviously, when there's so many players high up the pitch and they're so tight man for man, if you go over the top, you take all of those Brighton players out of the game instantly. So that's one example here of how United were trying to manipulate space to create the opportunity to use their forward players. So if we move the image on now to the second one here, you can see this is the aftermath of the long ball. Obviously the camera swung round, hence you don't see Onana anymore. But you can see still, Dahoud's there on Casemiro. You've got Welbeck there near Licha. You've got Mitoma sort of with Dalot, but he's obviously goal side there of Dalot, which is nice. And you've got Højlund duelling there with the centre-back. Now, the situation that United were trying to create here is lots of open spaces for Marcus Rashford and Rasmus Højlund. Højlund here was the target of the through ball, of the long ball, sorry. And the idea is that Højlund knocks it down, and in this situation where the teams are spread apart, we've created big spaces. Because Brighton are man for man, we've created big spaces as much as we can, and McTominay, Bruno Fernandes are sort of players that are supposed to thrive in these spaces. Marcus Rashford likewise. And so the idea here is that we create the create big spaces, knowing that Rasmus Højlund hopefully can win that, or at least force the centre-back to knock it down into a dangerous area. Then McTominay and Bruno can react quicker than any of the Brighton players, cover that ground quickly, that 2 to 5 yard sprint, whatever it is, to get to the ball. They can circulate it, make a couple of passes, because once the ball's sort of this side of these Brighton players, all it takes is a sprint from Casemiro before the Brighton player can react, and he's potentially free. The idea is then you suck the Brighton players into this sort of area here, and then you hit a long ball out to Marcus Rashford there. So that's how United were trying to manipulate Brighton. We finish off the sequence here. Picture 3 in the image here. You've got Bruno there, winning the ball, comes back to him. Then we get some nice interplay where I think Bruno plays it into McTominay, does well to evade his man, plays it into Eriksen, ends up going back to Casemiro, who sort of has this space free as Dahoud then gets attracted to the ball. And the idea then is, because you've sucked all the Brighton players in here, look, you've got pretty much everybody in here and a massive gap over here towards Marcus Rashford. Now, in terms of Brighton's out of possession job, with how man for man they were going, this is the really important point. So you can see Lamptey, let me draw, Lamptey here is right on Scott McTominay, and you've got Joel Veltman there on Christian Eriksen. Now, with the fullbacks tucking into midfield to try and control United's diamond, what does that leave out wide? Exactly as we were saying, big spaces there for Marcus Rashford, and on this side, potentially Rasmus Højlund if he can peel off. So that was the rationale behind the diamond and how it worked in the first 20 minutes to manipulate Brighton, creating space for United's players to attack. Final image in the sequence here is the ball coming back to Casemiro, and what you can see is as Casemiro receives the ball, he's got space there to play that pass out to Marcus Rashford, and what you're crying out for at this point is quality, because you've created a great situation for your team. You've got Marcus Rashford in space against the centre-back, and he got him booked early on, partly because of situations like this, but Casemiro overhit the pass and it goes out of play. Now, the final thing to mention in terms of this type of sequence is what it relies on from the players. So obviously it relies on them reacting quickly to situations. Once you put the ball long and you put it into areas, they've got to be able to sprint quickly, react quickly, and cover those 5-10 yard gaps. But also, once that ball has gone long, the players that are behind the ball have to get up the pitch really, really quickly. So you look at the start of the sequence, Lindelof was on the edge of his own box, Reguilón was really deep, Casemiro was deep. They've all had to make a really quick sprint up the pitch. Remember that, because that's going to be really important later in working out what went so wrong for United. The physical output here demands a lot of aggression, a lot of running, and a lot of sort of peak intensity action. So high intensity sprints, it involves quick accelerations, 5 yards to win that ball when it's loose and knocked down in these sorts of areas. And that is where things started to go wrong for Manchester United. So, in terms of Manchester United's in-possession plan, that pretty much covers it off in terms of what United were trying to do. And for the rest of the game now, it would be, quite frankly, remiss of us not to spend the rest of the time in the tactical view focusing on what Brighton did to United and how it worked so well to basically kill us. So in terms of the Brighton play when they were deep, at the start you had Steele on the ball and you had Lewis Dunk and Van Hecke coming in to receive the ball, as they often do. And for the first initial period in the game, it tended to be Dahoud here who was dropping in to try and receive in the pivot. So initially it was more of a sort of a 2-1 structure. And when Pascal Gross dropped in, rather than coming into the pivot here, he was actually coming in here almost as sort of a false fullback and pushing Joel Veltman on. Now what that meant was that when Brighton did play out to this side, by the time it went to Van Hecke and then went to Gross, Eriksen could just shuffle across, shuffle across, shuffle across. The whole team could then shuffle across really nicely like that. And what that meant was that by the time Gross was on the ball, there was no real forward passing option because Eriksen was sort of blocking that passing lane to Adingra there. And as soon as that ball went out to Veltman, that gap wasn't particularly big. So for the first 15, 17 minutes, Brighton really weren't able to figure United out. And the main reason for that is that they would have expected a 4-2-3-1 from United. And in a 4-2-3-1, obviously you've got one number 10, you've got one striker. So if we play with Højlund out on the right to start with, in that situation, with one number 10 and one striker, even if they pressed sort of like this as a front two, this two centre-backs plus this one midfielder dropping in from Brighton would have been enough numerically to overload that situation from United. So they set up for what they thought United were going to do, with just Dahoud dropping in. He should have been able to receive, because with Steele involved as well, they've got that 4v2, they should have been able to play out through Dahoud. But for the first 20 minutes, they didn't realise, and obviously they were surprised by United's different shape, and so because of that, they struggled to get out a little bit and United were able to press. Now, obviously the demands of when you're pressing in a diamond, there's a lot of demands on the midfielders here, Eriksen and Scott McTominay. So when Brighton played slowly out to one side, then rolled it out there, it was really easy for United because all they had to do was just shuffle, 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 and there's no real issue. United could do that all day long. But as the game went on, De Zerbi made a major tactical change. Now, just to bring home the point about what they were doing to start with, we've got a sequence here of sort of showing Pascal Gross's involvement and how it, in the first 15 to 20 minutes, it sort of killed Brighton, and then we'll show what happened after that and how he was the key man that dictated the game. So you've got Steele on the ball here, you've got this pressing structure that we talked about from United with Rashford, you've got Højlund and you've got Bruno. Now the idea here is that you're man for man against the centre-back, the opposite centre-back if you need to be, and then Bruno's watching De Hood dropping in. So that situation worked quite well for what United did to start with, and because Dunk is relatively narrow here, he's just sort of the width of the 6-yard box, those gaps aren't huge. So even if Steele does turn out and play to Dunk instead, Højlund can get there fairly easily. So the gaps are fairly narrow for Brighton, and United are well set up to counter it. And you can see what I was talking about there in terms of Eriksen's position, because Gross is here, Eriksen's just sitting in there, blocking that passing lane, meaning that even if Gross receives, by the time that pass has gone to Gross, Rashford's pressing from the inside, Eriksen can then jump onto Veltman. So the distances aren't very big and it doesn't require massive sprints from the United players. As we roll on the sequence here, number 2, I can get the pen up there. You can see Gross has received the ball. You've got Rashford pressing from the inside there. And you can see the United players pushing across. So it's so congested centrally with all of these United players moving across towards the ball. And that means it's hard for Brighton to find a forward passing option. Eriksen's not very far away from Veltman, so even if that pass gets in there, no real problem. And the crucial bit as well is that Veltman's virtually receiving on the same line as Eriksen here. Whereas later, when De Zerbi pushed the fullbacks higher, he was receiving 5-10 yards beyond him, and that made it really difficult for United to recover. Final image here we'll show is that it ends up with Gross taking a few touches on the ball, ends up being Bruno somehow doing the running there, maybe should have been Rashford, but by the time he's on the ball there, United are so well shifted across, there's no real options for Brighton to play forward. So in terms of what went wrong for Brighton and right for United in the initial period of the game, Ten Hag's tactical system worked because Brighton weren't expecting it, and it basically nullified any ability from them to progress the ball through the centre and forced them, if they wanted to progress it, they would have had to play big switches of play, which Brighton don't really tend to do. After 17 minutes, De Zerbi made a big change which completely changed the game. So we've talked about how initially Brighton built up in more of a 2-1 structure with the centre-backs relatively narrow and De Hood being the one to really drop in and try to get on the ball. We've talked about how Pascal Gross was mainly dropping into sort of a false fullback position here, which only had the effect of slowing Brighton's play down and making it easier for United to just shift across and reduce the effect of the diamond sort of wide players here, Eriksen and McTominay, having to sprint to get out to the fullbacks. So, what did he do after 17 minutes? What De Zerbi did was he told Pascal Gross, stop doing that nonsense, get in here in the pivot, and now he changed them to basically a 2-2 structure. And what that meant for United was that Marcus Rashford and Rasmus Højlund had a decision to make. So no longer was that front three able to basically exactly match the centre-backs and De Hood dropping in, but when Gross was coming in here, it was difficult for Rashford and Højlund because they had to worry about what was behind them as well as what was in front of them. And the other thing De Zerbi did at the same time, smartly, was move the centre-backs even wider. So now what happened was that when Steele had the ball, for example, you had Rashford sitting on Gross potentially. If Bruno was marking De Hood, Højlund might be going a little bit wider to Dunk, and there was always somebody free. Because now Brighton have got the 4 players against the 3 rather than the 3v3 that they had before. So that numerical advantage flipped the game in Brighton's favour. The other thing De Zerbi did at the exact same time as that was he told the fullbacks, rather than receiving the ball here, sort of on the same line as Eriksen so he can just shuffle across and get out, go and stand there. And Lamptey, go and stand there. And the idea there was that now, rather than just simply being able to shuffle out, Eriksen had to make a decision. Does he go and try and deal with the spare man here of Pascal Gross, or does he sit back and try and deal with Veltman? But if he does that, he just leaves space for either Gross or Van Hecke, whichever one's unmarked, to just carry the ball up the pitch unchallenged until they can exploit the 3v2 that they ultimately end up with in the wide area. Now, the other thing that Brighton do, which caused United all sorts of problems, was that their number 10, or basically a striker with Lallana and Welbeck, is that they dropped really, really deep into midfield. So what Brighton tend to do with the players at the front end of the pitch, if we just drop the fullbacks in a little bit deeper, is you tend to see Mitoma start really wide right on the touchline, same with Adingra, and the idea behind that is they're really wide and high. They're not really worried about receiving the ball in the first phase from the defenders, from the keeper. Their main responsibility there is to pin the United backline as deep as possible. And what that means is, because obviously once you've got a player here, that's where the offside line is. So once Lallana and Welbeck come in here, the United centre-backs have got a big problem. Now, from memory, last season United dealt with it pretty well, and you saw often Martinez following Welbeck in. But the problem was United weren't quick enough to then close that gap in there. So what we typically see happening was Brighton exploiting this 2-2 overload versus that front three of United here to give themselves a free man who's able to just take the ball up the pitch. And now obviously Eriksen's got to stay narrow and block this passing lane if Martinez hasn't followed him. So that means he can't then get out to the fullback. And that means then in this situation, what was happening was Adingra, if Martinez had sort of gone tight to Welbeck, Adingra would come into this gap here, bringing Reguilon with him. Veltman would go out here. And the problem was that because Lindelof and Dalot weren't tucking across quickly enough, Reguilon was left in a really difficult place here. If he goes out to Joel Veltman, all that's going to happen is he'll slip a ball down the side for Adingra, and Adingra will play the cutback. And obviously if Reguilon sticks with Adingra in this situation, Veltman will just run down the side, play across, or pull in a cutback himself. So what was happening was Brighton were having overloads, carrying their overload really from the first phase all the way up the pitch, and they basically presented United tactical problems that Erik ten Hag was quite simply unable to solve. Now, the bit that worried me most about this was that this was happening in the first half as well as the second. Now, in the first half, Brighton didn't make that good use of it. I think at half-time they'd really only created one good chance, which they ended up scoring from. But in the second half, as we know, the pattern worked time and time again, more on the left side rather than on the right side in the first half, but it destroyed United. And to show an example of what Brighton were doing, we've got this sequence here. So you start out here with Steele basically having played the ball into Dahoud there. And you can see the issue that United players have here. Because where previously Rashford could have, I think the ball's come in from Van Hecke back to Steele there. So hence Rashford's gone to press Van Hecke and followed in towards Steele. So Rashford's sort of curved his run round here with the intention of forcing Brighton to one side. And then if he does that successfully, the United diamond can shift across and prevent Brighton playing through like we did pretty successfully in the first 20 minutes. But because the Brighton had the extra player here, Bruno's got two to deal with. He's got to deal with Dahoud and also with Gross. And in this situation, he started with Pascal Gross. Dahoud ends up receiving the ball. Great composure from the Brighton player, and that's important in terms of the technical side. But he then ends up playing that way, completely breaking the flow of the United press. So whereas we're trying to force them one side, Dahoud ends up receiving, changes the flow to Van Hecke, and Van Hecke can just carry. Obviously, Eriksen's in a difficult situation here. He's got to sort of keep tabs on Gross, otherwise he'll just receive very easily, but that's going to leave the fullback unmarked on the opposite side. As we then roll this on, you can see now that the centre-back receives the ball, so Van Hecke in this situation is the free man here, and he's able to just carry the ball up the pitch. Eriksen can't really leave Gross until Bruno's got back in and got across the cover, so that means the fullback's completely free. Obviously, Reguilon's got that 2v1 to deal with because he can't go to the fullback without leaving Adingra, and because the striker's dropped in a little bit deeper, Martinez has left a big hole as well. So it's just from all angles really that Brighton are causing United all sorts of tactical problems, and it just was not dealt with. You can see that. You can see sort of the aftermath here. Bruno hasn't really got across to cover Pascal Gross there, so Eriksen can't get across to Veltman until the pass is gone. So he's a few yards away there. You've got Casemiro here dealing with Danny Welbeck. And then obviously you've got a 2v1 of Adingra and Veltman as he tracks up the pitch against Reguilon there. The final image I want to show in this tactical view today is this. And this shows you all of the problems in one go that Roberto De Zerbi gave Erik ten Hag. Now, obviously football's 11 versus 11. If you look at what's happening, if we draw a straight line, if that's going to work. Not a bad line, that. Relatively, that's probably better than the VAR lines we've had in the last couple of weeks, that. But if you look at what's happening this side of the line, it's 11 versus 10 in Brighton's favour, obviously with the goalkeeper there. So, given that the numbers are broadly similar, how is it that in so many different areas of the pitch, Brighton have got a 2v1? So in this wide area here, they've got 1 and 2 versus Reguilon. You've got the same thing on that opposite side there with Mitoma there, and you've got Lamptey. They've got an extra man in this area here, even without counting the keeper. They've got 4v3. And this is the problem that Erik ten Hag had, is that De Zerbi changed it, and his changes are bringing the fullbacks up the pitch, moving the centre-backs wider, and having this deep double pivot caused United problems that Erik ten Hag was quite simply unable to solve all game long. Now, the other problem as well is that I think often in football you can make up for a bad tactical setup or a few tactical issues by just being able to run through brick walls, and clearly this United team is not capable of doing that at the moment. Even Scott McTominay, who's normally one of United's best athletes by a long way, was struggling to constantly get out to Tariq Lamptey. Part of that is the tactical setup, of course, but part of that also is the terrible physical conditioning that the United players have clearly had so far this season and this pre-season. We shouldn't be seeing this many injuries, especially non-contact injuries. It shows you, let's be honest, it's not a problem with necessarily the medical side of the club, because they just treat injuries. It's a problem with the people that are supposed to prevent them. That's the conditioning side, that's the fitness coaches. Quite simply, the job that the fitness coaches are doing doesn't stack up to the demands of the way Erik ten Hag wants to play. He wants to play transitional football. As we saw in the opening minutes, he wants to create open spaces, manipulate opposition teams to create big spaces for United players to run into. That requires a lot of sprints, it requires a lot of accelerations, and those are intense actions. United aren't set up to do that, and you can see that in the way we pressed and the way we fell off throughout the game. Ultimately, Brighton's defensive setup didn't actually change throughout the game. It was the same as it was, same at the end of the game as it was at the start. So United should have been able to exploit the same situations we had in possession at the start, at the end as well. But the problem was that United weren't able to get a foot on the ball because we couldn't win it back, weren't getting around the pitch quickly enough, and when we did, the players were so exhausted, they were executing pretty much everything pretty badly. So you look at this, you see Brighton playing into one side, draw that United diamond across, play back out to the other centre-back, and there's a free man every single time, whether it's a centre-back, a midfield player, a full-back, or even these strikers dropping in. And the only conclusion that we can finish on with this tactical view is that United were tactically completely outclassed. As for the trip to Bayern Munich in the week, I think there are some positives of this diamond shape in possession, but out of possession we simply cannot persist with it. I would suggest the only thing we can probably do is keep the diamond in possession, because I think it did generate some good chances, but out of possession, as soon as United lose that ball, you've got to put Bruno back on the right, Rashford back on the left, and go back to that 4-2-3-1. Hope you've enjoyed watching this week's tactical view. It was a bit of a depressing one, but as we said at the start, that's what happens when United play Brighton at this moment in time. Hopefully it's better against Bayern Munich, and hopefully this tactical view is more upbeat and more cheery next week. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys all again very soon.